There are 10 main carnivore mistakes that nearly everyone has made at some point. So in today's video, I'm going to thoroughly break these 10 mistakes down and provide a solution on how you can avoid each one of them. The carnivore diet is the proper human diet. It's how humans are meant to eat. So if you're not feeling and looking your absolute best, there's a high probability you're doing one of these 10 things. I've had to learn many of these lessons the hard way, through trial and error. So I figured I'd make this video so that you can watch it, save all that time, and start seeing results much quicker. My promise to you is that if you watch this video and apply the things in it, you are virtually guaranteed to be successful on carnivore. So let's get into it. Mistake number 1. The first thing I see with many people is they treat the carnivore diet like they would with any other diet. We've all been told that if we want to look and feel our very best, we need to limit our portion sizes and heavily restrict what we eat. But this is simply not true. Not on carnivore. In fact, if we go back just 100 years before all of this diet culture was a thing, virtually no one was obese. It was only 0.5% of the population, whereas nowadays it's over 40%. So what changes on a carnivore diet, and why do you have to treat it differently to any other diet? It's simple. Your hunger works very differently on carnivore. When you're on a carnivore diet, you're consuming very small amounts of carbohydrates. This makes a massive difference. In fact, I largely blame this entire obesity epidemic on carbohydrates. Here's what happens when you consume carbohydrates. Carbs turn into sugar in your body, which then causes a massive blood sugar spike. This blood sugar spike usually lasts 1 to 2 hours. Then it crashes back down and goes below baseline. This is what is referred to as hyperglycemia. In this state, your body thinks that it's run out of body fat and that you're starving to death. We've all experienced this state. I can remember before starting carnivore, I'd have some oats, maybe some bread for breakfast, and for a couple hours I would feel great. But come 10 AM, I'd have this sudden energy crash. Everyone seemed annoying, and all I could do was think about food. It was a terrible way to live, but this is how most people live their entire lives, constantly hungry and moody. But here's what happens on carnivore when you eat a meal that consists of only proteins and fats. You get a much smaller blood sugar spike, but instead of coming crashing back down, it slowly makes its way down and never goes below baseline. This is why on carnivore, you never get that completely starving, I need to eat right now feeling. And for the record, having a smaller blood sugar spike doesn't mean you'll have less energy. You'll actually have more energy. Your body has a different fuel source, a much more efficient fuel source. I'll explain this shortly. But on top of not having these blood sugar crashes, because meat is the most nutrient-dense food on the planet, when you eat it, you're giving your body everything it wants. So it's incredibly satiating. You eat it, you feel full, and you stay full for a very long time. I was someone who used to have my entire life centered around what I was going to eat next. Even when I had a large meal, come an hour or two later, I'll be hungry again, thinking about what I was going to eat next. Whereas on carnivore, I'm literally never hungry. Now don't get me wrong, this is a great thing. Having zero hunger is a massive life enhancer, but it can actually lead to problems for some people. In particular, I see this a lot with women who do carnivore. They'll say they've been on carnivore for a while, but their energy levels, they aren't quite there. So I'll ask them what they're eating, and it often goes something like this. For breakfast, they'll maybe have a few eggs with a small piece of meat, and then they'll say they don't really get hungry throughout the day, so their next meal's not till dinner, and again, they'll just have a small piece of meat. As a result, their energy is just terrible. You need to think of your body as a car. We have this complex engine, but if you're not giving it fuel, it's just not going to go anywhere. It's not going to function properly, so you're going to feel terrible. So the first mistake a lot of people make is that they're just not eating enough. What's very interesting is that at the start, a lot of people actually experience a very opposite effect. Their appetite can increase significantly. This is very common with people who weren't eating a lot of meat before they started carnivore. Because in meat there is a long list of nutrients, vitamin B12, creatine, carnitine, the list goes on and on, but you can only get these nutrients from meat. So what happens when you haven't eaten much meat in the past is that all of these nutrient levels are very low. But then you get on carnivore. All of a sudden, your body's like, whoa, this is incredible. We want more of this stuff so we can top our nutrient levels back up. So what happens to a lot of people is that for the first couple of months, their appetite can actually increase significantly. But what you'll find is even if you are one of these people, after a couple of months, your appetite will come way back down. All your nutrient levels are now where they need to be. So all of a sudden, you too get this very low appetite. So for some people, this under-eating issue may not happen straight away, but it's also something you do want to watch out for. Anyway, that one's simple. Make sure you're eating enough. Now, the second mistake is actually very similar to the first one. Remember the car analogy. Your body is an engine and you need to power it. Well, on carnivore, something very interesting happens. You essentially unlock a superpower. Your engine, your body essentially starts to create its own fuel. Here's how this works. When you've eaten a high carbohydrate diet, for a very long time, your body's preferred fuel source becomes carbohydrates. Now, a lot of people like to make the argument about this. Well, if our body burns carbohydrates before it burns fats, this must mean it's our preferred fuel source, so we must run better on carbohydrates. Well, if that was true, I have great news for every alcoholic watching this video, because guess what our body burns before it burns carbohydrates and before it burns fats? You guessed it, alcohol. The reason our body burns these things first is because they are toxic to it. It wants to metabolize them very quickly so it can get them out of our system. But what happens with this high carbohydrate approach is that after your body has used the carbohydrates from the meal you've just eaten, it's not very effective at tapping into your own body fat for energy because carbohydrates and your body fat have very different structures. But when you don't have carbohydrates in your diet, so you're only eating fats and proteins as you would on a carnivore diet, what happens when your body's finished burning the fats from the meal you've just consumed is that it can then very easily tap into your own body fat because your own body fat and the fat you've consumed do have very similar structures. This is what is referred to as being fat adapted. So essentially your body, the engine, is creating its own fuel. You don't have to put fuel in externally in the form of carbohydrates. Your body just creates its own fuel from the fat you already have. But here's the thing, becoming fat adapted takes time. It's typically around the 2-week mark that you become somewhat fat adapted. And as time goes on, all the way up until the 6-month mark and longer, you become more and more fat adapted. But what a lot of people do is they'll see people online who have been on carnivore for a very long time. And these people, they only eat 1 or 2 meals per day. So they try to mimic what they eat based on the people online. But there's a massive difference. Because these people have been on carnivore for so long, their body is very fat adapted. They're very efficient at metabolizing fat. Whereas if you've just started out and you don't have this ability, what's going to happen if you're only eating once, twice per day is you're just not going to feel great. You're going to have low energy. There's a good chance you're going to be hungry. It's just going to make your carnivore experience very unpleasant. Now, you don't need to fast at all on carnivore. I personally don't fast at all. But if you are going to fast, at least wait a couple weeks before you start to skip a meal. Now, this next mistake, you're going to love me for saying it's a mistake. Right now, you're sitting there thinking, who is this bloke? Why has he got such a terrible haircut? But after I reveal this to you, you're going to be like, that's why I feel so terrible. In plants, there is this very fascinating compound. Unless you live under a rock, you've probably heard of it. It's called caffeine. Now, plants actually make caffeine to protect themselves. When insects try to eat a plant with caffeine, it actually fries their brain. But when humans consume caffeine, something very interesting happens. When you are tired, it is because a hormone known as adenosine is released. But for adenosine to work, it must attach to special spots in your brain called adenosine receptors. When it does, you feel sleepy. But here's the crazy part about caffeine. Here's what its chemical structure looks like next to adenosine. What do you notice? They are very similar, so it makes your body sort of glitch. Because caffeine looks a lot like adenosine, it sneaks into these spots and blocks them. Adenosine now has nowhere to bind to, so you're no longer tired. But adenosine's kind of important. It's what makes you feel tired, so therefore you go to sleep. If you didn't sleep, it would definitely not end well. So over time, your brain notices caffeine is blocking adenosine, so it makes extra spots for adenosine to attach to. But when caffeine intake suddenly stops, as in one day you decide to quit all caffeinated beverages, no tea, no coffee, adenosine now has more receptors to bind to. It takes a few days up to a month for your brain to down-regulate the number of adenosine receptors it now has. So during this time, because there is so many receptors for adenosine to bind to, you can have serious caffeine withdrawals, causing fatigue, headaches, irritability, and brain fog. What a lot of people do when they first start a carnivore diet is they decide to remove all plants at once. Because caffeine comes from plants, they now experience these withdrawal symptoms and they just feel terrible. In the past, when I've quit caffeine, I've felt tired, lethargic, sometimes it even felt like my brain wasn't working properly. So what can happen with a lot of people is you can be one of these people who is super prone to having caffeine withdrawals. And because it can last for up to a month, if you quit caffeine right as you start carnivore, you can feel terrible for a month. So because these people have low energy the whole time, they attribute it to carnivore, when in reality it's not carnivore that's to blame. So the next mistake is removing caffeine when you start out. A lot of people continue to drink coffee on carnivore, but if you do want to quit, do carnivore for at least 30 days, then remove it. However, in saying that, if you do have some serious medical condition, it's probably better just to be tired so you can get yourself healthy. But for everyone else, so you can feel the true effect of carnivore, wait 30 days at least. The next mistake is the most common reason for people having low energy on a carnivore diet. On carnivore, because you're not consuming carbohydrates, fats becomes your main fuel source. In this low carbohydrate state, your body now has a new fuel source. If you're eating very high fat, you'll be in a state of ketosis, which means your body is creating something known as ketones, and that is now its fuel source. Or if you're eating a very high amount of protein, you might not be in ketosis. Instead, your body creates its own glucose through a process known as gluconeogenesis. This glucose is created from the proteins and fats you eat, as well as your own body fat. But either way, your new fuel source requires a lot of fat. But what a lot of people think is high fat, it isn't really high fat. This is because we've all been told our entire lives that saturated fat is bad for you, so most of us have cut the fat off our meat. Now this is the biggest lie ever told. It's literally built on the back of fraud. But because this lie has been so ingrained in society, most people have just eaten no fat their entire lives. I remember cutting the fat off my meat, most of us did. So what happens to a lot of people? They'll start a carnivore diet. They hear they need high fat. They'll head to the supermarket, grab some fatty steaks. But what happens is because people are used to eating absolutely zero fat, a small amount of fat actually seems like a lot to them. It's the equivalent of when you're trying to fall asleep and someone turns a light on. It feels like they're shining a spotlight in your eyes, when in reality it's just the bathroom. It's all the way down the hallway. It's not actually a lot of light, but it feels like it's a lot. So how do you know if you're eating enough fat to fuel yourself properly? There's a very simple rule for this. At minimum, you want 0.75 grams of fat per pound of ideal body weight. Ideally though, you want 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight, which means if you are 200 pounds and your goal weight is 170 pounds, have 170 grams of fat per day. Or if you're 170 pounds and you're happy with your weight, you'd also aim for 170 grams of fat per day. Not only does fat give us our energy, it's also what builds our hormones. If you're not consuming enough of it, you're just simply not going to feel your best. So the next mistake is not eating enough fat. Try to hit this 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight rule and you'll just feel so much better. This next mistake is one that really annoys me. What you'll see is you'll go online and there's all these people talking about how the carnivore diet is deficient in this nutrient and this nutrient, and if you're going to do it, you need to add supplements. The two most common nutrients that are brought up are fiber and vitamin C. So let's break these down. Fiber. This one is incredibly easy. Fiber is not a nutrient. In fact, fiber literally can't be broken down by humans. This right here is the reason it's meant to be good for us. It helps us stay regular by mobilizing everything because it's indigestible. But this argument makes absolutely no sense. We also can't break down wood chips. Does that mean we should eat wood chips? And I very specifically chose that example because you know what's added to a lot of foods? Wood chips. Next time you're at the supermarket, check for something called cellulose on the back of packets. Often cellulose is literally added fiber from wood chips. I know it's hard to believe, even though we already know what the ethics of these people are like. That one takes it to a new level. So yeah, hard to believe, but most people are eating wood chips. There are millions of people that have been on the carnivore diet for a very long time and they've never run into digestion issues. In fact, they find the opposite. The absolute vast majority of people, in fact, I don't think I know a single person who hasn't said this, but after you've been on carnivore for a while, your digestion is flawless. At the start, there can be a couple of issues, which I'll get to later. But after a long enough time on carnivore, your digestion is perfect. There's no need for fiber. You're much better off without it. All it does is absorb water in our intestines, whilst it can't be broken down. And as a result, your stools get more blocky. It can lead to constipation. It's also an anti-nutrient, meaning that the nutrients you eat bind to fiber and they go along with it and can't be absorbed. Total scam, don't need it. Okay, time for the big one. Vitamin C. You definitely need vitamin C. Without it, you'll get scurvy. We've all heard the stories of these sailors going on ships, getting scurvy and dying. But here's the thing. These sailors, they weren't eating meat. They were eating sea biscuits, which is just dried grains. I actually feel bad for the poor blokes. Doesn't sound very appealing. But they were eating dried up grains. They weren't eating lots of meat. But where do we get our vitamin C from on a carnivore diet? Well, that might be the simplest question to answer in this entire video. If you eat enough meat, you get enough vitamin C. Now, if you look up online how much vitamin C is in meat, it may seem quite low in comparison to some plants, but there is a massive difference. Like I just mentioned with fiber, there's a defense compound called anti-nutrients. When these anti-nutrients bind with nutrients, they completely prevent their absorption. In fact, in studies we find that as little as 1.4% of the iron in spinach gets absorbed due to these compounds. So all nutrients, including vitamin C, when they're in plants, they're bound up. We absorb much smaller percentages of them than we do in meat. The vitamin C in meat is in its most active, ready-to-use form. But on top of this, because you're not consuming carbohydrates, you end up absorbing even more of it. Here's how this works. Carbohydrates break down to glucose to be absorbed. But here's the thing. Glucose and vitamin C both have very similar structures. So like we saw with the caffeine and adenosine, they also both compete for the exact same receptor to be absorbed. So when you remove carbohydrates from your diet, and therefore the glucose. Vitamin C no longer has to compete with glucose, and you absorb much more of it. There are millions of people who are on the carnivore diet, and have a guess how many cases of scurvy there are. Not a single one. Case dismissed, you get enough vitamin C. But okay, alright, why don't we just add some supplements to be extra healthy? Well, there's a couple of issues with a lot of supplements. Firstly, the casings. There's an array of different ingredients that they use for these things, but the vast majority of the time, it's just some garbage ingredient. But secondly, these nutrients, they're often useless. The nutrients that are in many supplements are synthetic equivalents of the nutrient. So you're literally consuming some lab-made chemical, and as a result, often what we'll find is that you absorb very small percentages of the nutrients found in supplements. You get all the nutrients you need in the perfect amounts from eating meat alone without any of the toxins. So the next mistake is adding unnecessary supplements. You just don't need them. Another mistake a lot of people make is they don't prioritize ruminant meat. But what does this mean? Ruminant meat is meat that comes from a ruminant animal, such as a cow or sheep. The name comes from their stomachs. They're called ruminant stomachs. And what makes these stomachs so great is they are incredibly complex. They have 4 chambers, which allows them to extract a very high amount of the nutrients that they consume. Because of this complex stomach, their meat is a lot more nutrient dense than, say, a monogastric animal, such as a chicken or pig, whose digestive system is a lot simpler. Because you're getting more nutrients in, what you'll find is that you have more energy. I personally find the more ruminant meat I eat, the more energy I have. Essentially every single person I've talked to says the exact same. On top of that, when we look at the fatty acid profile of ruminant meat, what we find is that it's actually a lot healthier. It's a lot lower in the inflammatory omega-6 fatty acids, such as linoleic acid, than say chicken or pork. In fact, in 100 grams of beef fat, there is roughly 1 to 2 grams of linoleic acid. But in 100 grams of grain-fed pork, which is what most pork is fed, it can be up to 14 grams of linoleic acid per 100 grams. Now, you don't have to completely avoid these other meats. I'm not saying that at all. These meats are still a great option. Even if you're eating just those other meats, you're still going to be so much better off than if you were eating a standard American diet. But in order to feel your best, the meat you want to prioritize is ruminant meat. But arguably the biggest problem when it comes to consuming too much of something on a carnivore diet is dairy. Now, dairy is definitely part of a carnivore diet. It comes from an animal, and it can be, for many people, a great addition. But there are a couple of main problems I see when people include too much dairy, or any dairy for that matter, for some people. The first is that dairy is pasteurized. What this essentially means is they heat it to very high temperatures in order to kill the bacteria in it. This allows it to stay shelf stable for a lot longer. It's why when you buy milk from the supermarket, it can last a while, whereas raw milk, which hasn't been through this pasteurization process, can only last about a week. Now, yes, it stays shelf stable for longer, but what happens is when it's heated to these high temperatures, some of the proteins start to become denatured. As a result, parts of this protein structure, which are not normally visible, these things are known as epitopes, they become visible. As a result, our bodies see this as a foreign thing. It becomes a threat, so we get an inflammatory response. For me personally, if I consume pasteurized milk, my skin just breaks out. For some people, they can have joint pain. You don't have to completely avoid it, but if you are noticing these sort of things popping up, it can definitely be too much pasteurized dairy. Also, if you have some serious autoimmune condition or other health condition, again, that's something you want to think about. But for me, the biggest problem with dairy that I see is that it just seriously stalls weight loss. The main reason for this is because it is incredibly high in energy. All body fat is stored energy. In order to burn fat and get leaner, you need to consume less energy than you burn. But on carnivore, we eat till we're full. And the thing with dairy is that it's very high in energy, but it doesn't fill you up very much. So as a result, your total energy increases and you burn a lot less fat. Now, if you're someone who's trying to gain weight, you can just apply the reverse logic to this, and then maybe you do want to eat more dairy. But if you're someone looking to get leaner, this is, again, definitely something you want to think about. So the next mistake is not prioritizing ruminant meat. Try to get as much ruminant meat in as you can. Like I said, these other meats are still great, but to feel your very best, ruminant meat is probably where you'll find that. And then when it comes to dairy, use it like you would a condiment. Say you're going to put some sauce on your meat. That's how you should use dairy. You definitely don't want to go around having, blocks of cheese as entire meals. This next mistake is the most costly one. What happens to a lot of people is they'll decide that one time they want to eat something non-carnivore. But because so many of us, myself included, have this all or nothing personality, as soon as you eat one non-carnivore thing, you start to get cravings. And then you say to yourself, well, you know what? I've already slipped off. I may as well just have some other non-carnivore stuff. I'll get back on it tomorrow. But then the next day, you've got the cravings again. So you tell yourself, oh, I'll get back on it next week. So what a lot of people do is they'll slip off once and they'll go, oh, well, I guess I'm no longer doing this carnivore. But they forget, you can just simply get back on the very next meal. If you slip off for a single meal, it's not the end of the world. For most people, you won't even notice too much. You might get some cravings, but it doesn't really matter. But if you have an entire cheat week, you're going to set yourself back weeks of progress. The main reason people completely quit is due to these cravings they get. But what they forget is that these cravings are only temporary. And when you understand why these cravings occur, you're much better able to deal with them. The reason we get cravings is for two reasons. The first one is physiological. You crave certain things because your bodies want the nutrients from them. This right here is why all bodybuilders, whenever they go on their cut, meaning they eat very small quantities of food in order to get lean, they typically eat very small amounts of red meat. So what do they start craving? Burgers. But on carnivore, because you're eating meat, which gives you every nutrient you need in the perfect quantities, this isn't the reason for cravings on carnivore. So the reason you get cravings when you slip off carnivore is purely psychological. Here's how this works. Human Psychology 101 is, at all times, humans are either trying to seek pleasure or avoid pain. The easiest way to achieve both of these things is to get a hit of a hormone known as dopamine. When dopamine levels are high, we have a tremendous sense of pleasure, reward, and motivation. We feel very good. But you know what gives you an insane amount of dopamine? Processed foods. In fact, these food companies literally have teams of scientists whose entire job description is to make it so these foods just give you so much pleasure, so when you eat them, you get a massive dopamine spike. One of the main ways they do this is they target something known as the bliss point, which is the perfect ratio of sugar, salt, and fat. And when they hit this spot right there in the middle, you just feel incredible. So what happens is your brain remembers this. If it ever wants to seek pleasure and avoid pain, which it does at the same time, it knows, well, we can just eat this one food. As a result, you crave it. But here's the good news. When you haven't consumed something for 2 weeks, your brain completely forgets the amount of pleasure it got from it. This is why when you slip off, you start craving lots of things. You remind your brain how pleasurable it is. This also applies with everything. It's why drug addicts or alcoholics, for the first 2 weeks of quitting, all they can do is think about their substance of choice. But as soon as you get through this period, once your brain's forgotten how much pleasure you got from it, the cravings go away. So you need to remember the cravings don't last. When I first started carnivore, I craved everything. Now, after being on it for nearly 500 days, I genuinely cannot remember the last time I've had a craving. Like genuinely, it was probably 490 days ago. I do not crave a single thing. So that's the next mistake. Slipping off once, getting cravings, and then completely quitting. You need to remind yourself they're gonna go away very quickly. This next mistake results in a lot of people accidentally slipping off. What happens is a lot of people, they'll go to the store and buy their favorite carnivore foods. Let's say they're getting beef patties, bacon, maybe some beef jerky too. But here's what's in these foods. All of these items are over 20% plants and chemicals. Now again, eating this way is still a lot better than a standard American diet. It's better to eat 80% meat than 0% meat. But if you're someone who's trying to heal, trying to feel your very best, you can find alternatives to these foods for the same price. So this next mistake, it's a very simple one. Make sure you check the ingredients on what you buy. It only takes a few seconds and it can make a world of difference. This next mistake is another very common one. And along with not eating enough fat and not eating enough in total, this right here is one of the most common reasons people experience low energy. What so many people do is they'll start a carnivore diet and they'll put the same amount of salt on their meat as they typically would. But this right here is a big mistake. Approximately 40% of salt is sodium. Now, sodium's very important. It helps our body retain water. If you're not retaining enough water, you have fluid balance issues, and then you just can't function properly. You don't have good energy, you'll have brain fog, it can lead to cramps, so you need to ensure you have adequate sodium levels in the body. For most, your body is used to consuming a lot of sodium. In processed foods, there's a ton of it. But then they'll start a carnivore diet, and they won't replace the sodium that they were getting from processed foods. They'll still put the same amount of salt on their meat as they typically would. But not only are you consuming a lot less sodium, you actually retain a lot less when you first start carnivore. Remember those blood sugar spikes I talked about earlier? When you eat carbohydrates, you get a large blood sugar spike. Well, in order to bring your blood sugar back down, another hormone called insulin is released. This right here is the primary job of insulin, and having lower blood sugar levels and less insulin is a very good thing. However, insulin has another role, and that is to help the kidneys retain electrolytes. So because sodium is an electrolyte, when you first start carnivore and your body's not used to being in this low carbohydrate state and it's excreting a lot more of it, what can happen is you run into low sodium issues. You're retaining less, you're consuming less, it's really a recipe for disaster. So when you first start carnivore, what you want to do is put more salt on your meat than you typically would. The general rule for this is the salt to taste. You want your meat to taste just pleasant. It's got a nice salty taste to it. For some people, this can seem like an extreme amount. Me personally, when I started, I was putting ridiculous amounts of salt on my meat. But that was simply just what tasted good to me. What you'll find is that over time, you just naturally want less and less salt on your meat. Even if you're putting the exact same amount on, it just starts tasting saltier and saltier. So naturally, you'll use a lot less as your body becomes more efficient at retaining sodium in this low carbohydrate state. For those worried about consuming too much salt because they know it can lead to high blood pressure, when you have healthy kidneys, you just urinate out excess sodium. The main reason people have too much sodium in their body and therefore get high blood pressure is because they're consuming too many carbohydrates and they have chronically elevated insulin levels. This is what is referred to as hyperinsulinemia. But on carnivore, because we're only having small blood sugar spikes and therefore we have a lot less of this insulin, pending you're a healthy individual with healthy kidneys, this shouldn't be a concern. So the next mistake is not having enough salt when starting a carnivore diet. Remember, if it tastes good, even if it seems like a lot, this is your body's way of saying, we want this amount. Final mistake occurs simply because you have not yet adapted to carnivore. For many people, there are three main issues when you first start a carnivore diet. The first is cravings. We discussed this earlier. They go away quickly, you just need to remind yourself that. So issue number one, cravings, dismissed. The second issue is low energy. Again, we already discussed this earlier. Your body is not yet used to running on fats. Give it time, and again, your energy levels will pick up significantly. So issue number two, low energy, case dismissed again. This leaves us with just one issue, which may potentially be the scariest issue of them all. In order to not scare away my female viewers, what I'm going to do is play a clip of Joe Rogan explaining this issue.
Did say something in your post about a explosive diarrhea.
It needs to have a new name. Diarrhea is not strong enough for what I was experiencing.
For real?
Yeah, it was like someone was tapping into an oil well.
Ah, jeez.
I have pictures. You want to see pictures?
So why was that happening?
So why does this happen? Should we be concerned, and what can you do in order to prevent this? Luckily, this is completely normal. It can be easily explained and there's a very simple solution. Firstly, your entire gut microbiome, which is centered around what you eat, that is to change. This bacteria has to go somewhere. Secondly, your body is ridding itself of plant toxins. When you stop consuming plants and therefore the toxins in them, your body can detoxify itself much more easily. Again, because of this, these toxins have to go somewhere, so it leads to loose stools. But the third reason, which is the main reason, is due to something called bile. For fat to be broken down, bile must absorb it. Without bile, fat literally cannot be broken down. You can't absorb any of it, so it just goes straight through you. Here's how this works. Bile is created in the liver. It is then stored in the gallbladder and then moves into the intestines to break down fats. The problem that arises with bile is it is demand driven, meaning that if you did not eat a lot of fat before starting carnivore, you're not going to be producing that much bile. So here's what happens. You start a carnivore diet and you listen to some random bloke on the internet with a terrible moustache tell you you need to eat a lot of fat. So you massively increase the amount of fat you're consuming, but the amount of bile you're making currently is very low. And it takes a while for this bile to upregulate. It can often take around a couple weeks. This right here is why it typically takes 2 weeks for people on carnivore to see their stomach issues resolve. For some, it can take a bit longer. For me, it took, I can't exactly remember how long it took, but it definitely took a little bit longer than that. But what you do need to remember is that it definitely will go away. I had terrible IBS my whole life growing up. At one point, I had to take a month off school. And when I started carnivore, I did have some of these stomach issues. But what I find now is my digestion is flawless. One other tip to avoid this is don't consume too much hot rendered fat. You know when you cook ground beef or mince, depending on where you're from in the world, and that hot fat like cooks out of it and sits at the bottom of the pan, because this fat is in its liquid form, it's a lot harder to break down. So if you're having fatty ground beef, try to let this fat come to room temperature or have it cold so it's in its more solid form. So issue number 3, all you have to do is avoid hot rendered fat and give it time. Case dismissed. So the final mistake is quitting too soon before you've adapted to carnivore. Remember, all of these symptoms go away. The carnivore diet is the proper human diet. It's our biological, species appropriate diet. If you eat this way for long enough, you're going to feel and look the best you ever have. Do not quit too soon, you've got to give it time. Remember, all of these things are only occurring because your body is ridding itself of plant toxins. It's not the meat that's doing it to you. The meat's healing you. Blame the plants. If you don't make any of these mistakes, you are well on track to achieving everything you hope to achieve on carnivore. So to quickly summarize so you can remember all of these mistakes and therefore avoid them. The first mistake is not eating enough. The second mistake is trying to fast straight away. The third mistake is quitting caffeine at the start. Unless you have a serious health condition, then you probably should. The fourth mistake is not eating enough fat. The fifth mistake is adding unnecessary supplements. The sixth mistake is not prioritizing ruminant meat. The seventh mistake is letting one slip off ruin everything because you get cravings. Remember, they'll go away, get back on it next meal. The eighth mistake is not checking ingredients. The ninth mistake is not having enough salt, in particular at the start, and the 10th mistake is not giving it time. One thing a lot of people do on a carnivore diet is they decide to eat fruit, but this is not a good idea. In this video, I break down why. Anyways, thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed, learned something new, see you next time.